Hello, and welcome to the Women Designers You Should Know podcast, the show that celebrates the groundbreaking contributions of women designers who have shaped the world we live in today. On today's episode, we'll discuss the life and work of industrial designer Evelyn Ackerman, whose work was prolific during the Mid-Century California Modernism era. But what makes this episode even more exciting is that we're joined by her daughter, Laura Ackerman-Shaw, who offers a unique perspective and personal insights on the incredible work of her mother. Laura Ackerman-Shaw is a Stanford University graduate with bachelor's and master's degrees in English literature, both 35 years of experience in publishing, and has been the executive director of Ackerman Modern since 2015. She passionately preserves and promotes her parents' design legacy through museum exhibitions, presentations, scholarships under their name, preserving their archive of work, writing articles, and licensing her parents' products with brands like Design Within Reach and CB2. So let's get started. So, welcome, Laura. It's so great to have you on the podcast and to talk about your parents and especially your mom, Evelyn. First, I thought it would be great for our listeners to hear a little more about you. You've been the steward of their archive for nearly 10 years. Do you do this full time now, or tell us a little more about it?
I think my husband would say I do it full time, but I don't. And thank you, Amber, for having me. This is really exciting, and I love the work you're doing with women designers and recognizing them. So thank you for including Evelyn in it. It's been a really wonderful ride for the last decade because watching things become more important in a scholarly realm and more valued in sales and auctions and people rediscovering my parents' work is really, really fabulous. And they saw some of that while they were still alive, and they were just, I think they were sort of amazed, and it was wonderful.
Which leads me to my next question. What was it like growing up with iconic mid-century modern designers as your parents?
Well, I think like most children of designers or people who were known in their field, I had no concept that they were important or iconic or had an influence. And it really took me years to understand the significance of their contributions. But I'm artistic, but definitely not as talented as my parents were. And so I didn't have crayons at home. We had pastels and colored pencils and paints and X-Acto knives. And we had a
Wow.
really big, wonderful studio that my uncle had originally built and my parents attached to the house. So that was a wonderful place to be an artist. And I was always encouraged to experiment, and nothing was ever wrong. It was all about the process. And then in my bedroom, I had these two wonderful pieces. I had a garden hooking that my mother designed and they sold over my bed, and sort of these two children with a tree and these little birds. And then this big applique my mother had done called The House That Love Built, which had finger puppets that my mother had made for me. And then those finger puppets became a preschool fundraiser. And then ultimately they wound up in California design shows and House Beautiful magazine. And then my parents would do things like write and illustrate books for me or create puppet shows for my birthday parties and applique pin the tail on the Pegasus, because who needs a paper pin the tail on the donkeys? And then my mom stopped smoking. And in order to keep busy, she built me a dollhouse where she actually even made ceramic tiles on the floor and she wallpapered.
Wow.
I think really what my parents taught me through all of this was that it was important to be ethical and tenacious and optimistic and creative and develop friendships. They had these incredibly long lasting, wonderful friendships. I mean, we really won the parent lottery. They were fabulous people.
That's great. So let's get right into Evelyn's story. Just to give our listeners an overview, Evelyn Ackerman, alongside her husband Jerome, was a leading figure in mid-century California modernism. Her colorful and whimsical designs span ceramics, mosaics, tapestries, wood carvings, and hardware, embodying the Bauhaus philosophy of blending art, craft, and industry for accessible quality goods. Her design style ranged from geometric minimalism to biomorphic abstraction to figurative stylization, highlighting her intuitive use of pattern, color, line, proportion, and composition. Evelyn and Jerome's pieces from the early 50s through the early 80s gained recognition nationally and internationally, and have been seen in museums and even on sets in movies and television. Despite retiring from manufacturing in 1979, their legacy endures, captivating collectors today and resonating with a new generation drawn to their collaborative spirit and unwavering dedication to their artistic vision. So Evelyn was born in 1924 and the youngest of 5 children, 3 older brothers and a twin sister. Is that right?
Yes, and my mom they were fraternal twins. So her
Okay.
sister Rosie, yep.
She didn't grow up in an artistic house and wasn't exposed to art until she was in college, but she loved to draw and had an innate ability. A brilliant student, Evelyn was gifted in painting, illustration, lettering, ceramics, and graphic art. She started at the University of Michigan, but World War II broke out and her 3 older brothers were enlisted. And to be near her mother, she transferred to Wayne University in 1942. For her, this was a turning point because they had a very strong art history and studio art departments. In 1945, she received her BFA with a minor in art history with honors and entered the MFA program on a scholarship. Evelyn graduated with her MFA in 1951. And in fact, both Evelyn and Jerome received MFAs, which feels very unique. And so it's obvious how important education was to them. So tell us a little bit about how Jerome and Evelyn met and got married.
Well, I think it's really a love story that informs their entire life and career. They grew up in Depression era Detroit, literally just blocks apart from each other. They attended the same elementary, middle, and high school, Central High in Detroit, but they didn't meet because they had a 4-year age difference. And then they both wound up at Wayne because it was the more affordable college option. Cranbrook was too expensive for them. They couldn't afford it. They met one time in the art department. And then World War II happened, and my dad left to participate in that. My mother, in the meantime, was sort of this belle of the ball in Detroit. She was beautiful, she was intelligent, she had a lot of suitors. But interestingly enough, she always said she would have married my dad the first day she met him. She was really drawn, I think, to his intelligence and his wit, and he had a beautiful singing voice. He came back, and my mother at that time was working for her sister-in-law, Lucy Lipton's interior design studio. And a friend of my father said, "Oh, you should go meet this beautiful woman." And he literally happened to be in the neighborhood. It was cold. He had like a Milky Way in his pocket, and he said it was like a story out of a movie set. He walked in, there's this beautiful woman surrounded by luxurious fabrics. There's a fire in the fireplace, and he introduces himself. And my mom is very pragmatic, says, "Yes, we met before at Wayne." What happened? And my dad said, "Well, a little thing like World War II kind of happened." So he then very suavely asked her if she liked Milky Ways, and it turned out to be her favorite candy bar, and the rest of, they say, is history. So they married on September 12th, 1948, and they actually worked together their entire 64-year marriage until my mom passed away.
I love that. And a turning point in their story, too, is one day in 1949, Evelyn and Jerome Ackerman, young newlywed art students, went to the Detroit Institute of Arts to see an exhibit called For Modern Living. Jerome said it opened our eyes. There was Eames furniture and Visosky carpets, Kurt Versen lighting. We walked through all that and said, wow, that was a fresh and exciting alternative to the mundane, what your mother had, doilies on a table, kind of traditional home decor. I think that's so funny too. It's kind of like that seems to be a generational thing. We always aren't really into what our mothers have in our homes either. And after that exhibit, they drove to the Herman Miller showroom in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and bought their first modern pieces of furniture. More important, the show gave them a vision for their future. They looked at each other and said, if the Eameses can do it, maybe we can do it too, or at least we can try. So they moved to California in 1952. They opened, is it Janev?
Hmm.
design studio. Okay, Janev. Wanted to make sure I was saying that right, which is a combination of their first names, Jerome and Evelyn, which is so fun. And I feel like they were probably doing that way before everyone else is doing that because we've seen that so much since.
They thought it sounded very European. The first year, while my father was developing all the shapes and glazes, my mother, Evelyn, supplemented their income. They had to pay their bills, right? So she worked for Red Skelton for $1 an hour. She answered all the fan mail and she corrected all the ad libs in the scripts. The really interesting thing, I think, is Janev begins to show the collaboration of them as artists. And
Hmm.
my father's shapes, and there were many of them, some of them she decided to decorate, and then they introduced that into their line. And so these long stoppered bottles and trays and some other pieces, she would decorate individually. Every single one is different. They're all hand drawn, and she would do a technique called sgraffito. I think what happened was my mother was really good at taking the form and then finding the illustrative complement to it and doing something that elevated the design and made it more interesting. And then in 1955, they went to San Francisco and they saw a mosaic exhibit, a sort of Romanesque, mostly pebbles, and once again came back and said, well, my mom said, I can do that. Let's do mosaics. And so they introduced this line of mosaic tables where they would produce the inlay. What they began to realize was a scalable business model did not mean them making everything. And that is
Mm.
how I think things started to morph in their business approach, which we can talk about later.
And I love how Evelyn talks about their partnership of having perfectly matched strengths when it came to the business. He was outgoing and gregarious, and Evelyn was shy and introverted. And so, when it comes to their designs, how would you separate who did what? Is it fair to say Jerome did three-dimensional work with ceramics while Evelyn did the two-dimensional work? Or how would you separate their design strengths?
My father was sort of graphic oriented, and definitely ceramics was his first love. My mother, though, really became the primary designer. And my father, because I think he was so relationship building and people oriented, ran the business. I think the really interesting thing about them as a design couple is that they maintained their individuality, but they collaborated closely and had these distinct artistic visions that they managed to meld. They also had tremendous respect for each other's abilities. And my father felt my mother was much more talented than he was, which was always sort of interesting to me. But, I would come home from school and my mother had this drafting table in the studio that a friend had built for her in the late 40s, and it would be covered with drawings. I mean, just covered
Wow.
everywhere. And so she was constantly thinking of visual ways to present things because she had a lot of background in painting and illustration, liked the illustrative approach of working on two-dimensional objects. And then those could be translated into mosaics or tapestries or bas-relief plaques or hardware. But the bulk of the work after Janev was my mother's designs. It's amazing because you see something that's very figural, almost whimsical, and then you see something very graphic and bold and abstracted and with these saturated bright colors. These came from the same person, and you would never know it if you put them alongside each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this Genève period really was from 1952 to 1956. So in 1956, they started Era Industries, and that was when they really moved into finding production in Mexico and Japan and Italy. And they even expanded into different materials too. So maybe you can share a little more about this era phase for them.
With Era, they expanded beyond the ceramics, and they, like I said, they started with mosaics, and then soon they realized they could not produce these things themselves. But what's interesting is designer craftsmen, every piece they produced and sold commercially still had hand work, right? It still was produced by a
Mhm.
craftsman. So they blended this sort of Bauhaus philosophy of it wasn't a crime to have other people or methods produce your work. they really managed to scale up production, but still in limited runs. So, they might order 6 of something or 10 of something. They weren't ordering hundreds and hundreds of pieces. So this little company that people thought was this large company was my parents reaching out, finding skilled craftspeople in places like Mexico and Japan and Italy and Greece, and no FedEx, no computers, no anything. So it was all done with phone calls and letters. And my mother would develop these palettes in warm and cool colorways. And so she wanted them to be as flexible for interiors, whether they were residential or commercial, as possible. And all the big architects and interior designers of the day used their products. So Gruen and Gensler and Elwood, Mayer, Koenig, Palmer and Kreisel, Lautner, Luckman, and, interior designers like Elrod Chase, Hirsch, Muriel Hagen. They also worked at one point with a high school friend of my dad, Cheryl Brody, and they established a company with him called Panel Carve. And my mother created all the initial designs, and you still can see them periodically in situ. She said she was so consumed by the project that she did 25 designs in the first week.
Wow. Was she just sketching what would go on those designs, and it was in production that they figured out the depths of those designs?
She actually would do initial sketches and then she'd refine them. And then she sent very detailed instructions. So there would be, say, for example, a black and white pencil drawing that had 3 or 4 different colors of pink on it. Light pink
Oh,
represented this depth. And so she would talk about where she wanted it to have a more sculptural quality, what kind of tools to use. Did she want it to have a rough finish, a smooth finish? Where did things need to be delicate? That drawing would be created in a master by a master wood carver, and my mother would approve it or have it refined. And then that master is what was used to produce the rest of the panels.
that's
So she gave
amazing.
very, very detailed instructions.
Did we cover their process, or was there anything else that you wanted to talk about in
Well, I
terms
think
of what their process looked like?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about their process is partly because they did it all themselves. My mother would make these initial concept sketches, and maybe there were a bunch of different color options. And then she would send a color, usually a tissue, small, and sometimes with yarn samples, and then a full size template, like an outline, almost a paint by numbers. And if it was going to Mexico, say for mosaics, the colors might be noted in Spanish, or it might
Mm,
the color might match to a numbered mosaic tesserae book so that the artist would know which colors place in what areas. And so sometimes they would standardize, which also meant, on the flip side, that my mother had to design for that shape and size. So her compositions work within these constraints. The largest looms in Mexico, for example, were 44 by 70, so she couldn't make a weaving larger than that. I think they did a lot of back and forth.
hmm.
Sometimes pieces had to be rewoven over and over because they just weren't meeting my parents' quality standards. Or my mother would look at it and say, "No, you're not handling my design the way I envisioned it." And then they would approve them. The other component to all of this, starting in the late 50s, they participated in Los Angeles gift shows. And those were for stores like Bullock's and Macy's. And every 6 months, they had to have new designs because the buyers would come in and say, "What do you have that's new?" So there was this constant stream of having to produce and produce and produce. And then things changed over time. Earth tones kind of got popular in the 70s. There were some things that were inspired by the moon launch in 1969. And that
Mm.
there's this wonderful tapestry called Launchpad that's a very stylized sort of almost rocket ship.
Oh,
So
yeah.
the cultural things of the day, the colors of the day, the need to constantly have new materials, all of those things, I think, played a part in how my mom designed for the medium and material and the capabilities of people producing for them.
They definitely knew what they were doing, and they dedicated their lives to it too, and they were just go, go, go. And in fact, I see a lot of similarities between them and the Eames too. And the Eames really are known for creativity in everything they did in their lives. And that's what really feels like the Ackermans too, is that they're really in this life of creativity in everything they did and dabbling in so many different things. And they even have a similar Michigan to LA storyline, and the way that they complemented each other too, of like, introvert and extrovert, and their broader perspective of applying design across mediums too. And like the Eames, for example, were even doing film and stuff like that.
Right.
And so there's kind of this fearlessness in both couples of learning something new and applying their design eye to those things too.
Something that was very different from my parents than from the Eames was that the Eames had a company behind them. They had Herman Miller to produce their work and
Oh,
organize their
right.
furniture. My parents didn't have that. So they were
Mhm.
a much smaller scale operation.
And another similarity too, you see couples like the Eames and even the Vignellis, where they were known as collaborators, but in that era, the wife was usually portrayed as a supporting character to their husband, or never really given credit in that time. Whereas now we know that they were much bigger parts of the business than what they were seen as in that era. But at a glance, it doesn't seem to be the case with Evelyn and Jerome. It seemed like Evelyn was known as the designer, and you see the EA monogram or sign off on her work.
Well, I think what you've highlighted in your series is how much women's contributions were underplayed and underappreciated. And I think my parents were very different because their lives were so intertwined. But Evelyn got credit. I mean, and she didn't ask for it. I suspect it may have been my dad, but
Yeah.
the brochures or the labels on the back would say an Evelyn Ackerman design. They felt that that was important and a selling point. What ironically happens is there are a few of my father's designs that are credited to my mom by people. I'm like, no, that was actually my
Wow.
dad's, but that's okay. I think it was very unusual in that time period, starting in the late 50s, where she was put front and center. And I
Hmm.
think that was the result of them being so collaborative and having so much respect for each other. When you do a search, she comes up way more than my father does. And I
Hmm.
think she would be somewhat embarrassed by that and somewhat surprised by that, but I think ultimately very gratified for that level of recognition.
Let's talk about Evelyn's design style and her sources of inspiration. I think there's so much to say about her style in particular. It's so unique.
Well, as you mentioned, she did not grow up in an artistic household. I don't think she even saw the Detroit Institute of Art until she was in college. She took 11 art history classes. And I think what happened was she fell in love with the German Expressionists, Rembrandt, Cezanne, Klee, and Matisse, which is kind of a broad variety. But it wasn't just like she didn't just love painting. She loved sculpture and all sorts of other things. So I think one of the things that's remarkable about her is here she was trained in fine arts, and then here she becomes this versatile designer with this broad artistic expression in this prolific body of work and materials. So she was really good at taking a technique that she was exposed to and then saying, well, I can do that, but I want to apply it with my style and I want to do it in a modern way. And so I think her artistic vision was really enhanced by this broad art history background that she had. She had such a spectrum of references, whether it was classical, medieval. She did a lot of kings and queens. She had themes that you can see run through her work. She liked children and animals, but she also loved Native American, African, Asian folk art. She loved folk art. And she loved the idea of this hand wrought, organic, warm, textural, colorful, optimistic sensibility. I think that really imbued her work. And so she would take these inspirations and then move them into her own interpretation and style. She had this very sophisticated, informed style so that even if she did things that were figural in nature, they were not childish, they weren't juvenile.
I feel like a standout of her style for me is her stylized approach to these animals and people that you were mentioning, and even abstract shapes that she created. It all felt very optimistic and confident, yet playful. It was extremely imaginative. And if our listener isn't familiar with her work, I would recommend checking out the Instagram video of her work. I'll leave the link in our show notes. She had kind of a trend or a series with this idea of these elongated things, elongated people and dragons and cats and the kings and queens that you're mentioning and the knights on tall horses and tall girls holding flowers. And she applied these to all of these different mediums on wood carvings and tapestries and door pulls and even on Jerome's tall ceramics. And maybe that was the start of it, was because she was doing that first. And then you just kind of saw this consistent style throughout her work. And I feel like it's so iconically hers and so unique to her. And if that's not enough, she was fearless when it came to materials. I've tried to put it in order too, and I hope I have this order right, but it seemed like she went from the sgraffito, is that what you were saying, on the ceramics, to the mosaic designs, and then she went to tapestries and silk screens on wool, brass door pulls, and the wood relief carvings, and then the hand hooked rugs and wall hangings, and then even embroidered wall hangings, and eventually to enamel cloisonnés and finger puppets. Like, she just wasn't afraid of any material.
She liked to experiment and try different things. And I think, it's interesting, the rug piece that you mentioned, just very briefly, they had wanted to do rugs, but it was really competitive and there were lots of people doing rugs. So then they were like, well, they could be used as a rug or a wall hanging. So
Yeah, I think that's a good idea too, because now they've lasted. Like, they
right.
haven't been walked on all over. And now her beautiful, like, hand hooked wall hangings can be passed around because they've still kept intact. Yeah, in fact, one of my favorite quotes of hers is, "Before you can design successfully, it is necessary not only to visualize the possibilities of the medium, but also to understand and respect the limits of the technique." And so it's so obvious when you see her work and when she designs the same thing on different mediums, how she's very much designing around the limitations too. And I love seeing that in her work.
Yeah, and I think she also pushed boundaries because, like I was saying, these craftspeople are like, what are these hot pinks and bright oranges and turquoises? And,
She was
and
really pushing them.
she was really pushing them. And I think the juxtaposition of these colors with the compositions and the designs really speak to how she was able to visualize the end products.
So, since you're her daughter, I'm really curious to know what your favorite piece of hers is.
I think that's an impossible question, but I will say that she did this charcoal drawing of me when I was 5, and I had this floppy red cowboy hat that I loved and I wore all the time. I mean, all the time. And it's of me, and it used to hang in the entry to their house, and I have it now. And it's a beautiful drawing, but it also just like says everything about how much my mother loved me and
Mm,
how invested she was in my happiness and my protection and nurturing me. It just really, really speaks to me.
that's
But
beautiful. Where is it now? Is it in your home?
it's in my house.
Good.
And it's on newsprint, so I'm always worried it's gonna deteriorate in
Oh,
light exposure. So, but, it's been around since 1965, so I guess so far so good.
good.
I also, I love her collaboration on the ceramic pieces, and part of the reason I love that is because it represents both my parents. But I think in terms of the things that were produced commercially, there's this wonderful mosaic called Rain. It's very large. There are only a few that exist because my mother made them all. This was sort of
Oh,
me going to Mexico. And it's this sort of moody piece. It's two girls holding umbrellas and there's rain coming down and it's very stylized. And then the girls' dresses are full of these fabulous patterns. And then again, these wonderful colors. And then you kind of add the luminosity and the depth of the mosaic. And I have this coffee table that she made that used to be in their house, and it's cats. And it also uses this mosaic that's got it's clear glass, but it has gilt on it. So it makes this wonderful sort of metallic look. And it's again very abstracted, very stylized, really different. but I also love the things like striped candy tree, which is this great bold sort of design launch pad. And something she did in the late 50s called Autumn Trees, where it's a again sort of stylized depiction of these trees, and then there are these little colored squares in it, and they're just beautiful pieces. But I wish I could hang everything I owned in my house, but I don't have enough wall space. So
Yeah. Well, that's why you do exhibits.
right.
Their work is so iconically mid-century modern, and of course, it's popped up in movies and television. And so, tell me more about where it's popped up. Did your parents see this? When did you discover these moments where it's popped up? I'd love to hear more.
I flipped on the TV and there was NCIS Hawaii and Jane Tennant, the one who runs the operation. She's in her office and I was like, that's my mom's panel carved design on that desk. And sure enough, I tracked down the company that had sold it to the set designer and he bought it from a PR company on Wilshire Boulevard. And it was a custom made desk for this guy that used some of my mom's designs. So, sometimes you just see something randomly. There was an episode of Gilmore Girls that has a Campesina tapestry. It's like, what is that doing back there? And, the set
Wow.
designers had pulled it. But because my parents had a showroom and they only sold to the trade, what would happen is they would get set designers who would come in and they would generally not buy the work, they would generally borrow the work. And
Mm.
so they didn't always tell them what it was for. And so there's this really fun pair of girls, again, sort of elongated. I guess I hadn't thought as much about that. One's holding a bird cage, one is holding flowers. And sure enough, they pop up in like Freaks and Geeks and a Selma Hayek
Wow.
got milk commercial. And the first use was something that somebody actually sent to me because people are very nice and say, did you see this? And I'm like, no, but great. And it's in a Twilight Zone episode from 1962 that had Carol Burnett in it called Cavender is Coming as sort of the guardian angel. And he's in her apartment. And what's in her apartment but this tapestry on the wall?
Wow. Now I'm so tempted to go back to all of these old shows and look for those
I
because
know you
it's
could kind
so
of go down
cool.
the rabbit hole watching for them, but I think
Yeah.
one of my favorite things is this garden hooking that used to hang in my bedroom and was designed in the early 60s. My father, at some point came home with a Playboy magazine, which was not typical of my father, and he said, you've really made it when you're in Playboy." And he flips open to this John Dempsey cartoon and sure enough, it's this guy who's in like a crocheted vest and bell-bottom pants, and his wife's sitting on the couch, and he's saying to her that he's going to drop out. It's like this whole sort of hippie aesthetic. And what is on the wall behind the couch but a rendition of the garden hooking? So my father,
Wow.
I think that delighted my parents more than anything else. And so I love the idea that they were recognized in their by contemporary uses. And then, of course, when something calls for vintage, like there was a movie called Almost Famous, and when he's in his growing up period and it's set in
Mm,
the 60s, the set decorators use these things. So,
I
they're
love
usually,
that.
yeah, they're usually background pieces and sometimes they're there for a blip, but it's just really wonderful. It's the kind of thing that kind of grabs me and gets me all excited. And if my parents saw them, they would be like, oh my God, look, we're famous.
Oh, that's so great. And I'm curious to know, are any of their products in production still, or aside from buying an older vintage piece, is there any way I can get my hands on an Ackerman?
Well, for a period of time, Design Within Reach had a collection of Janev ceramics, not with the sgraffito, and those have since sunsetted. But I have this wonderful design collaboration with CB2. They added my parents to their Design Legends series last fall. There are some pieces that are actually almost reproductions. So there's a couple of tapestries, that Autumn Leaves that I said I love so much, and then there's a tapestry called Op 66 because it was designed in 1966 and op art was kind of big. It's this wonderful geometric sort of rhythmic pattern. It's 24 by 72, just like the original was. It's hand
Wow.
woven, just like the original was. They have a black and ivory version. and then they did a blue and black version. And so for less than $400, you can have pretty much an Evelyn Ackerman hand-woven original, which I think is pretty phenomenal. And I think
Yeah.
what it does is it allows a new generation, a new audience to see my mother's work and to be
Hmm.
introduced to it and maybe get excited by it and want to learn more about her life.
Where can we see Evelyn and Jerome's work in permanent museum collections today?
Well, my mother has a series of cloisonnés at the Renwick Gallery in the Smithsonian. They're
Oh,
not always
yeah.
on display because most
Okay.
museums don't display their permanent collections unless they're
Hmm.
cycling through a show. The LA County Art Museum has a nice selection of their pieces, and they had an ellipses mosaic in their Living in a Modern Way exhibition, and then pulled a launchpad tapestry and the same ellipses mosaic for their Found in Translation exhibition, which was about the relationship of California and Mexico in design. And the Milwaukee Art Museum just acquired a big tapestry. The Henry Ford Museum has works. The Oakland Museum, Palm Springs Art Museum, Long Beach. So there are
Wow.
pieces, but I think the best way to see them will be Cranbrook Art Museum is having an exhibition on modernism next summer, and there
Oh,
will
great.
be a tapestry in that. And then I'm really excited because Craft Contemporary Museum in Los Angeles is going to be mounting an exhibition that is in its early stages. So I don't even know a title yet, but it will be opening at the end of September next year. So if you're in the Southern California area, that would be
Oh,
great. And
yeah.
Barn Company New York are going to do another show next either spring or fall as well. So there will be some opportunities to actually go see the pieces on display, and it'll only be a small amount because there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of designs. You could never display everything, but it'll be
Yeah.
fun to have 2025 be kind of a watershed for having multiple exhibitions in multiple places.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. And not only that, but some of their panel carved doors are on permanent buildings that people can see publicly too. Is that right?
Yeah, they're on what used to be the Allen Ladd building in Palm Springs. It's interesting because the doors are in Trina Turk's showroom in New York.
Oh,
Because when they remodeled the building, they sold those and she bought them. And actually, Trina Turk and Jonathan Adler are people who sort of cite my parents as inspirational when they were starting because
wow.
seeing an artist actually be able to make a living and be successful at it, I think that gave them a lot of confidence that they could do the same thing, and they loved their work. So that's really nice. It's interesting. People have panel carve on their doors, residential, commercial. I just stumbled on a pair of doors at I think it's an apartment or a condo in Santa Monica. I had no idea they were
Wow.
there. I mean, how long have they been there? I don't know. So my parents sold their work nationally. You might see a house in Cleveland for sale and it's got Evelyn Ackerman doors on it, or something that's in Florida in a magazine and somebody has an Evelyn Ackerman mosaic hanging in their kitchen. So it's really interesting to see how widely dispersed things are. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the installations have fallen victim to people remodeling or tearing down, and that's really unfortunate. But
Mhm.
there are still pieces out there kind of living their best life on somebody's door.
Yeah, I bet your parents are so proud of the work that you've been doing, and that's so incredible of how you're helping their legacy live on and their designs to still be appreciated and in people's homes today, too. So, thank you so much for joining me today. And it's been so great to hear all of these stories, especially from their daughter. So, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for including me. And I'm really honored that my mother gets to join the panoply of incredible women designers that you've been highlighting. Your series is remarkable.
Thank you.
To learn more about all the amazing work Laura has been doing for her parents, follow at Ackerman Modern on Instagram and visit ackermanmodern.com. And as always, if you found this episode inspiring, please rate and review, and don't forget to subscribe and share it because there's a lot more episodes coming up. Together, let's redesign history by celebrating women.